for joining us tonight. My name's Lindsey German, and I think we've got a fantastic meeting and film showing tonight for you, which I hope you're going to enjoy. I know there's people who've joined us from all around the world, and we're very, very grateful for that. This is one of the great advantages of the Zoom broadcast, that you can join in from anywhere and at any time. Just to say, the way this is going to work is we're going to have around 45 minutes with our two guests, who I'll introduce in a minute. We're then going to give you a link so that you can go to watch the film. You can't watch it on Zoom, but you've already been sent a link, and I'll explain this again to the best of my ability at the end of the session. But you'll be able then to watch the film, and you can watch that at any time this evening. So you've got a bit of flexibility there. So thanks for joining us. I'd just like to say as well that if you've just coming across Stop the War, I hope you'll get involved with us. And in particular, I'd like you to join up and support us. We're part of an international movement, but as you're going to hear and as you're going to see, we need all the support that we can get in this world, which is so full of weapons and war. So what I'm going to do tonight is firstly to introduce the two speakers. We have Andrew Feinstein, who is the author of the book Shadow World. He's also the writer or the co-writer of the film that you're going to see. He's got a fantastically interesting background, his involvement in South Africa, which I hope we'll talk about a little bit. And we also have Lowkey, who is a political campaigner, an activist, and a rapper, of course, as many of you will know. So thank you both very, very much for joining us. I'm going to ask you a couple of questions, and then I expect we'll have time for some questions from viewers. So Andrew, first I'd like to ask you what kind of motivated you, not just to make the film and to write the book, but what was it that perhaps in your background and your political development, why was it that you began to see these questions of arms trade, of the very secretive networks that exist around this? Why was this something that you became so interested in and you've done so much about?
Thanks, Lindsay, and thank you so much to Stop the War for co-hosting this with Shadow World Investigations this evening. Stop the War, in my opinion, is one of the leading anti-militarist organizations, peace organizations around the world. So it's really a great pleasure for us. So thank you for all your work and for doing this. And thanks, of course, to Lowkey for joining us. If you haven't heard his soundtrack to The Struggle 1 and 2, then you need to. In my opinion, probably the best anti-war music that has been written in many generations. So it's an absolute pleasure to be on here with both of you tonight. Very quickly, I'm a white Jewish South African. I was born in Cape Town more years ago than I'd care to mention. And this was during the time of apartheid, obviously, in South Africa, perhaps the most brutal, racially driven and legislated racist state that we've seen on the planet, certainly in the post-war period. And I was in some ways really fortunate. Of course, growing up white, I was extremely privileged, but my mother, who was Austrian, was a Holocaust survivor. She lost 39 members of her family in the camps, and she only survived because she was hidden in a cellar for 3.5 years in Vienna itself. So whenever there was a raid by the Gestapo or the SS, she'd be rolled up in a carpet and put up against the wall. And that's how she survived detection. So I suppose I grew up in a household very conscious of what the consequences of racism were, what the consequences of militarism were. And that probably led me to an association with the African National Congress, the ANC, the party of Nelson Mandela. And I worked very closely with ANC people when it was still a banned organization in the townships and squatter settlements around Cape Town. Had to leave the country during the mid-80s to avoid serving in the apartheid military. And when I was able to return to the country, when the ANC had been unbanned and Mandela released, I worked as a facilitator in the negotiations process that led to our first democratic election in 1994, and then felt extraordinarily honored to be elected an ANC member of parliament in those first democratic elections. And those first few years of our democracy were remarkable. The national interest was more important than anything. We destroyed our nuclear weapons arsenal, the only country, I think, in the world to have done that in recent times. But unfortunately, as Nelson Mandela was retiring, and I should probably show my T-shirt, but as Nelson Mandela was retiring and his successor, Thabo Mbeki, was taking office, and Mbeki had really been schooled in neoliberal economics, which the ANC unfortunately adopted after our first democratic election, Mbeki decided to spend $10 billion on weapons, for which South Africa had absolutely no need and have barely used until today. And I started investigating this in my role on Parliament's Public Accounts or Financial Oversight Committee, and discovered that the primary reason for this transaction was about $350 million of bribes that had been paid by the companies, including BAE Systems, the British company, with the help of Tony Blair, who was Prime Minister at the time. They won a contract that the South African Air Force said publicly they weren't even shortlisted for. The Air Force said they would only accept the jets if forced to do so by the politicians, which they were. And the consequences of this is that a country with massive socioeconomic needs misspent billions and billions of dollars in ways that had enormous repercussions immediately. So to give just one example, finally, it was calculated by Harvard, by the School of Public Health at Harvard University, that the decision to spend all of this money on arms while claiming that we had no money to spend on antiretroviral medication for 6 million South Africans living with HIV or AIDS, led to the avoidable deaths of over 360,000 South Africans over the following 5 years, and the birth every year of 32,000 HIV-positive babies. And that's because we couldn't afford to buy people who couldn't afford the medication themselves, to buy them life, effectively. And I initially thought that we had just been particularly naive and gullible in South Africa as a young democracy. But as I researched my first book, I discovered that what happened to us happens all over the world, and that these huge weapons makers, with the significant involvement of their governments to the very highest level, were doing this to countries all over the planet and wasting absurd amounts of money to pursue wars because of the economic benefits to themselves.
Okay, Lowkey, for you, I mean, you're obviously, you know, you've been politically involved for a good many years as well. What was it you felt was particularly special about the film and about the book and this whole argument? Because it is particularly shocking about South Africa, which many of us look to the end of apartheid as a totally different, you know, transformation, and in many ways it was, obviously, but that you still have these, you know, it reverts to these kind of things in the same way that Britain does, that all sorts of other countries do. What did you get from the film particularly?
Well, firstly, I'd like to say thank you so much to Andrew for his kind words and for inviting me to be part of this. His work is so important in so many ways, and I hope that people are watching this are able to benefit from his film and get inspiration really to mobilize more. Also, thank you to Stop the War for putting this on as an organization. The importance of the largest global mobilization simultaneous in recorded human history, that was the March Against the Iraq War, is something that we have to emphasize again and again and make sure the history books capture. Because when governments do things directly against the will of masses of their populations, often the elite narrative tries to paper over it. And we actually see that this movement, which was part of the reason Jeremy Corbyn was propelled into the leadership of the Labour Party, really does make them quake in their boots. And the evidence is quite clear from the way in which the Stop the War movement and anti-war thinking is dealt with by the establishment media. Now, in response to your question, I think the wonderful thing about this film is that it marries the macro to the micro in terms of the share in corruption from global trade. The arms industry accounts for 40% of it. So while during the film they focus on the micro level, which is quite a scummy arms dealer, it never focuses on magnifying that at the expense of the larger and the macro picture. And so it looks into the Yamama deal, it looks into the way that Tony Blair, when asked about the dropping of the investigation into it, looked at George Bush with this almost arrogance and laughed at the audacity of someone really to ask this question, as if there could be any type of real accountability. When we look at and as Andrew said, you know, we go back and look at the speech in which Eisenhower coined the phrase, the military-industrial complex, which originally he'd wanted to refer to as the military-industrial congressional complex, but he rethought it and on advice from one of his speechwriters and changed it back to the military-industrial complex. The point that he makes still stands today, that when you spend all of this money, and let's not forget that NATO accounts for 53.9% of all global military spending, when you pour all of this money into weapons that take away life, you, as Eisenhower said, you take away hospitals, you take away the paving of roads, you take away essential life-giving services that people need. And I think that that is something that you take away from the film, especially when you look at what would potentially connect me on a personal level to some of these issues. I live opposite the Grenfell Tower. I lost a friend of mine in there. I witnessed it, and his whole family died in there, including 72 of my neighbors. Now, the F-35 fighter jet has been a project that is considered the most expensive weapons program in recorded human history. $1.4 trillion spent on it and to operate across its lifetime is estimated that it would cost. Now, the company that made the PE Renabond cladding, which contained polyethylene on it, on Grenfell Tower, also participated in the building of the F-35. So in a personal way, I feel directly linked to that, that aspect of it. Besides looking at the research that has been done into exactly how many jobs are created from every billion that is invested in the arms trade, if you compare it to the amount of jobs that are created for every billion invested in education, in green energy, in healthcare, it's radically different. You create far more jobs when you invest it in those sectors. And that's something that people have put a lot of energy into researching. So if we want to build a better world, we want to build societies where people are taken care of, an important documentary I think people should also check out in addition to this is the one about the Lucas plan. I was honored to interview Brian Salisbury last year, who was one of the organizers in Lucas Aerospace. Now, as I'm sure others will know the story, they approached Tony Benn to around the possibility of nationalizing the company to keep their jobs safe. Now, Tony Benn, the late great Tony Benn, told them that if you can come up with contraptions and machines you can create with your expertise and know-how that are alternatives to weapons, then I will see what I can do. Now, they went away and they came up with a list of over 70 things that they could make with the knowledge that they had, from dialysis machines to hybrid engines to other things that people could have use for in society. Now, when that exists from below, when you have the TUC pledging and supporting the idea of a defense diversification agency within the Labour Party, when you have over 60% of Labour's membership saying they are against Trident, despite the fact that somebody like Nia Griffiths says that Trident is an important sort of red line that we can't cross. We actually see that there's plenty of pressure from below for people that say, we don't need to invest all of this money in weapons that take lives. We can invest this knowledge, this expertise, and this human resource in things that help people rather than hurt them.
Yeah, and this brings me on to the question really about, you know, the film is very, very good about Thatcher and Blair, and they're very, very important roles in this internationally, that obviously many, many countries are involved. But also it strikes me this whole argument about British aerospace, which is very, very central to British capitalism in terms of profits, in terms of arms sales, and the argument about jobs is a very important argument, because I think for all of us, I hope we don't want anybody to lose their jobs. We don't want people not to be able to earn a living, but there has to be an argument put. It's not good enough just to say you work on Trident, that's okay. You work on nuclear submarines, that's okay. You work on fighter jets, that's okay. There has to be an argument that you can change these jobs into something which would be socially useful, which would produce things. So I suppose my next thing, just briefly, is about Thatcher and Blair, because they very much set up, not just were they directly involved in much of this, but they also set up a situation where you now are told that lots of the jobs that we depend on do depend on arms sales. There's no question about this. And you know, just what impact did they have on this aspect of politics? Andrew, do you want to?
Yeah, huge. I mean, I think to continue from what Lowkey was saying in answering your question, I mean, a number of very good economic studies have calculated that on average, you would create between 3 and 7 additional jobs in more productive economic sectors like green energy, education, etc., for the same amount of public investment as we get in the defense sector. It's an incredibly economically inefficient way to create jobs. But I think the importance of Thatcher and obviously Reagan's role in creating the current conjuncture that we have in relation to the arms trade is, of course, the advent of extreme neoliberalism. So the massive deregulation, the privatization of state industries, that's how BAE was created. BAE was effectively created by the revolutionary economic reforms of Margaret Thatcher. I mean, they were incredibly damaging, but there's no doubt they were revolutionary. And this company, very soon after it was created out of a number of other largely, but not exclusively, state-owned British companies, was very quickly in financial and economic trouble. Because the one thing that has struck me about all of these countries that I've studied, all of these companies that I've studied all over the world, is how bad they are at the business they do. You know, it really is a false economy, because they're given these massive government contracts. They deliver, I mean, in the US, for instance, on average 5.5 years late on major weapons projects. They go tens of millions of dollars over budget, and they simply get recompensed for that. In addition to which, there is massive public investment into these companies. So think of the UK today. BAE Systems not only gets subsidies for various people working on research and development, but think about all of the marketing and promotional work that the government does for it around the world. In virtually every British embassy, there's a military attaché who is basically a salesperson for BAE, Rolls-Royce, and others. In our Department of International Trade and Business, or whatever they call it now, they keep on changing the name, the vast, vast majority of people working on export promotion work exclusively on the promotion of arms exports, because we see this as tied up with national security, foreign policy, etc., etc. And that's a whole nother question, is the absurdity of the foreign policy argument. But to stick to the Thatcher and Blair dimension of it. So they effectively, Thatcher created this industry, which was completely subsidized. She claimed to be this extreme free marketeer, and created one of the most state-supported industries we've ever seen in modern economic history, and then gave all government support she could to this industry. And crucially, they allowed them to behave in a completely illegal and amoral manner, because they were an integral part of the corruption that took place in these deals. So to give you an example, on the most corrupt deal in history, the Al Yamamah deal, in which BAE Systems paid around £6 billion of bribes, and that's B for billion. And that's a figure from London's Metropolitan Police, not my figure. Even Margaret Thatcher's son, Mark, received a bribe of £12 million for effectively carrying his mother's handbag around and enabling certain arms dealers to have access to her. Similarly, Tony Blair has made an absolute fortune personally from his decision while in office to support BAE and to support the invasion of Iraq, lying to his cabinet, to Parliament, and to the British people. He personally has benefited from that in economic ways. And the most tragic thing, Lindsey, in answering this question is that what the film shows, I mean, we obviously start with Reagan and Thatcher because that was such a crucial moment, but in showing Blair, Obama, and others as integrated into what we describe as the global national security elite, we see how systemic this is. And, you know, Cameron, of course, was similarly involved. Boris Johnson, this is the sort of industry that somebody with Boris Johnson's complete lack of morality will absolutely adore. And of course, the royal family in the United Kingdom are involved as well. When the decisions were taken about those South African arms deals, the 6 ministers who were making the crucial decisions about what to buy and who to buy it from were invited to dinner in Cape Town Harbour on the royal yacht Britannia, where Tony Blair and Prince Andrew hosted them. The only surprise and shock to me was that Jeffrey Epstein wasn't there as well. And this is the nature of this global arms trade that is conducted in our names, using our tax pounds and dollars to subsidize these absolutely appalling companies. And that's before we even get to the question of the human consequences of the weaponry that they're selling.
Yeah. Lowkey, do you want to come in on that? Or?
Well, what I would say is quite interesting, that manufacturing in this country from the Thatcher period has absolutely been slashed. You are looking at 1 in 5 of the jobs in the arms industry going since the turn of the century. You have many people laid off or in insecure work in many of these places. And that, in a sense, it speaks to the fact that Britain is not at a stage where it should be the world's second largest arms exporter. You know, you're in a place where Britain is projected to fall from the 5th or 6th largest economy to the 11th largest economy over the next few decades. The 20 fastest developing economies, none of them are in Europe, and some of them are former British colonies. Britain actually should put its resource into reconfiguring its relationship with the rest of the world, rather than a policy which has, you know, suffers from, as Paul Gilroy calls it, post-colonial melancholia in the way that it deals with other people around the world. As Andrew said, when you look at things like the direct subsidies, you have hundreds of millions of pounds pumped into the arms industry. Billions is spent on research and development projects for the arms industry. And, you know, the Department of International Trade has many people working as ambassadors when really they could be promoting other things that Britain could export rather than this. And the question has to be asked, when you have this most subsidized of industries only representing 1.7 in terms of value, 1.7% in terms of value of British exports. You look at BAE Systems, as subsidized as it is, only representing 0.6% of Britain's GDP. It just doesn't justify itself. And I think that these are important arguments that need to be made clearly. When you weigh them up and you look at the balance between influence and between public money in terms of what it brings into the country, it just doesn't make sense.
Yeah, and I think that you've got this legacy of empire, obviously, that Britain is a declining power, but still uses arms sales and its military, which is still a considerable force. It is the largest in Europe. And obviously this costs us all very, very dear in terms of welfare and the welfare state and all these other kind of things. I've got some questions that people have put in. One is about the role of the merger of DFID and the Foreign Office, which I don't know if either of you want to say anything about. Another is this question of the scrutiny of where arms go to. I mean, this is a question from Mark Campbell, who's written quite a long thing, which I'm not going to read out, about the situation of the Kurds and the way in which Turkey is using weapons from bought from Britain in order to repress the Kurds. And what scrutiny is there? What scrutiny comes from Parliament? What does it amount to? These weapons are sold quite deliberately in many cases, knowing that they are about repression of particular groups of people. We know this. So do either of you have anything you'd like to comment on those questions? There's also one about Venezuela. Why don't we hear about the coming war in Venezuela? I mean, I would perhaps add to that, there's a number of places you can see which are sort of flashpoints around the world which are being subject to sanctions and all these kind of things. And obviously the weapons, I mean, these wars, you know, they're not dependent on the weapons in the sense that it's not just about the armed sales, but obviously this plays a very important role in it as well.
I think crucially, the one dimension that we should never lose sight of is how the weapons that are flowing into a conflict so often make that conflict more bloody and ensure that it continues for a long time. So, you know, the book starts, and unfortunately in a 90-minute film, we couldn't deal with all of this. It's a 555-page book with almost 3,000 footnotes. But the first of the modern arms dealers was a guy called Basil Zaharov, who was the first guy who used to take the brown envelopes stuffed with cash and leave them on ministers' desks as he left their meetings. He was a confidant of Prime Minister Lloyd George. And despite the fact that he ran a whole conglomerate of defense companies and owned newspapers and banks, much like happens today with large corporations who are involved in the defense industry, he was one of Lloyd George's emissaries to the Paris peace talks. And by all accounts from those peace talks, he spent his time there ensuring that there was no prospect for peace. So I think that that is very important to bear in mind. Then in terms of the control of arms exports, I mean, around the world, what the conflict in Yemen has shown, where the UN expert panel on Yemen has reported to the UN Security Council, which has its own structural problems that some people have noted in the comments, that the Saudi Arabian and UAE-led coalition in Yemen is constantly violating international humanitarian law, is probably engaged in war crimes. Around 20,000 innocent civilians have been killed, not as collateral damage. They've actually been intentionally targeted by the Saudi-led coalition. And it is the weapons of the United States of America and the United Kingdom primarily, with a few other countries involved as well, including Spain and France, that have enabled them to keep on doing this. So we see innocent civilians being targeted and killed, and we sell them more and more weapons. We have sold them billions and billions of pounds and dollars of weapons as the conflict has been ongoing. So what this shows us is that the legal regime, the control regime, is on paper only. And countries are quite able to completely ignore it. At the moment, according to a British court, British arms sales to Saudi Arabia are unlawful. That has led to barely a pause from the British government in the pace and scale of armaments being sold to Saudi, to UAE, to Egypt and others. So the arms export controls are broken. In the British Parliament, as an example, President Trump has just walked all over him in the United States like he does everything else. In the United Kingdom, we have had for a number of parliaments now a frankly weak and pathetic committee called the Committees on Arms Export Controls in Parliament. It stopped meeting a while back. Why? Because the Conservative Party didn't want the committee to discuss arms exports to Saudi Arabia, the biggest recipient of British arms. So the committee stopped meeting. They then managed to get an agreement to start meeting again, so long as they didn't discuss arms sales to Saudi Arabia. So at the height of the Yemen conflict, the one powerless committee in the British Parliament wasn't even discussing the exports that were violating British law. That committee has not met once since the new British Parliament has convened. That's in over 6 months. That is the state of arms export controls in the United Kingdom and the United States of America.
Lowkey, would you like to come back on some of those questions?
Yeah, well, to talk partly to the question around Blair and Thatcher before, is that both of them are along a lineage and belong to an orthodoxy of neoliberal necropolitics. And what we have seen is management of that situation. Robin Cook put it this way, that the key to the garden door of number 10 Downing Street was owned by BAE Systems, and he's never known number 10 to come up with a decision that didn't accommodate BAE Systems. When we look at the way the state behaves in relation to the arms industry, there is an incestuous revolving door type relationship. It was tracked that from senior military officers and Ministry of Defense officials, around 3,500 jobs in arms companies had been taken up by former officials within those government bodies. So yeah, it's a development of those things, I would say, of that bonding between the state and between these companies.
Okay, thanks. Now, look, I wanted to ask, there's a question that's been asked about, does the film say anything about racism and the particular, given the particular situation we're in, which obviously I'll ask Andrew to respond to, but I wanted to sort of slightly widen that question because obviously we're living through the Black Lives Matter movement, which is a tremendous outpouring about racism internationally and has mobilized many people. I mean, I think in this country, some of the places where there have been demonstrations, we certainly haven't seen them since the demonstrations against the Iraq war. And in some places, I don't think we even saw them then, you know, in some of the small towns where they're taking place. And that's a tremendous thing, really, of how big this is. And I wanted to ask that because I feel that we should discuss, and I'm sure both of you are involved in discussing these things on a daily basis. But I'd also like to say there's both the question of racism generally, but also we've always in Stop the War said that one of the products of the war on terror has been the rise in Islamophobia, and that this has been a major feature of the world, and it's become in many ways the kind of state ideology of countries like Britain, you know, a state ideology of a country like Britain. So I'd like you both to talk about that. I mean, maybe I'll get Lowkey to come in first, and you've talked about Grenfell anyway, and perhaps elaborate on some of those, and then Andrew, and perhaps you come in, and perhaps this probably will be the last question that we'll get. So, you know, let's see how we get on anyway.
So at least 2/3 of all British arms sales are to the Middle East for use within the Middle East. The last major wars that Britain have been involved in have been in Middle Eastern countries or in countries where Arabic is the main spoken language. In order for that to be an acceptable status quo, the war on terror going on longer than World War I and World War II put together, you have to have, as Paul Holden actually puts it in Indefensible, a level of threat inflation that becomes part of the general cultural ambience of a society. So hence, when you look at World War II, it wiped out 2.5% of the whole world's population. Yet we're in a situation where in 2006, 76% of Americans believed the world was more dangerous than at any time previous to it. As Chris Hunter makes the point, an expert on terrorism for the British government, your chances of being anywhere near an act of political violence are 1 in 16 million in Britain. You're more likely to drown in the bathtub or be shot by a toddler with a handgun in the United States. But yet it is essential for that threat inflation to take place, to lead people to live in the perpetual fear that not only justifies the imbalance in terms of public funding to bodies that deal with war, but it also justifies the loss of civil liberties that we have seen for people in these societies. Also, if we were to look at some of the organizations who constantly pump out the stories which are reproduced uncritically by the British press, the think tanks like the Henry Jackson Society and others, if you look at who the signatories are on their mission statement, you're looking at Richard Dearlove of MI6, obviously. You are looking at figures from the Bush administration. You are looking at figures from the intelligence services in Britain and the United States. Now, Henry Jackson Society is one of the key irrationalizers of Muslims on a domestic level, and also the obfuscators for these wars that we have seen create so much suffering, pain, death, and trauma. And so it's important to identify these things as not organic processes. They are key lessons in astroturfing and the ways in which very wealthy, very powerful people, if you trace the funding of some of these figures, you look at someone like Tommy Robinson, for example, Donors Capital is an organization that pumps money into him. We know money comes from the Koch brothers to them. You look at other connections between some of these figures. It is an expression of the will of the powerful to have people constantly focusing on their neighbor or the person that's next to them in their job as their enemy, rather than the person that is trying to send them to war or to get them to accept and acquiesce to the taking of civil liberties in exchange for an idea of domestic tranquility.
Thanks. Andrew, would you like to comment
Absolutely.
on those questions? One other question that somebody called Jago has put in. Have you got any advice for a young journalist? So you might want to put that in as well. I know you were saying more investigative journalists.
Absolutely. So very quickly to say, I've just put on the chat a video that I did on how the arms trade makes you sick. Because before we come to racism and Black Lives Matter, let's just deal for a moment with the coronavirus epidemic and the fact that one of the reasons that we were so ill prepared is because of the threat inflation that Lowkey was talking about. I mean, it's extraordinary that in 2016, 43% of Americans thought that a member of their immediate family was likely to die in a terrorist attack in the next 12 months. Whereas in fact, what was far more likely is that they would be shot in their own home with their own gun by a toddler of 5 years and younger. So I think that this is very important, how we've completely misapplied what the priorities in the world are. And of course, we haven't even come to the climate crisis at all. So have a look at that video if you get the chance. But I think the key here is, you know, what we were talking about Grenfell is a consequence both of neoliberal economics and a systemic and insidious racism that is becoming more and more apparent in more and more of our governments. And the US and the UK are unfortunately amongst the best examples at the moment. And what is crucial to the system is the militarization of policing and the sorts of things that we have seen that have led to the Black Lives Matter protests around the world. There's a brilliant documentary film made quite a few years ago called Do Not Resist, about the militarization of policing in the US. And there's this extraordinary scene in the film where the mayor of a tiny town that has 100 and something inhabitants buys this massive armored vehicle, surplus stock that the US Army used in Iraq. And he drives through his little town in this ridiculous militarized vehicle that is too big for the road, so it drives on the two sidewalks. And just that image reflects both the absurdity and the danger of the extreme militarization of policing. And part of what C. Wright Mills described as a militarist mindset, where we see everything through a military lens. So we talk about, you know, if there's an illness we have to fight, it's a war on whatever that illness is. We've had this interminable war on terror. But at the same time, the extraordinary thing is that the country we sell most of our weapons to, Saudi Arabia, is also amongst the biggest ideological supporters of, financial supporters of, and weaponizers of the supposed terror that we are waging war against. So there's this sort of lack of logic that enables these billions to be spent that aren't making us safer. In fact, what they're doing is making us less safe, less healthy, less democratic, and a hell of a lot more corrupt. The racism dimension of this is obviously incredibly important. When we see things like Grenfell, when we see things like the murders we've seen in the United States and elsewhere by police, it is because neoliberalism has implicit in it a form of white nationalism. And in parallel with it, whenever an anti-establishment political figure appears who seems to be gaining significant popularity, ironically, certain tenets of racism are then inverted and used against them. So we've had, and I say this as a Jew, the son of a Holocaust survivor, so we've had this whole thing about Jeremy Corbyn's an anti-Semite and the Labour Party is anti-Semitic. Bernie Sanders, himself Jewish, is an anti-Semite. Those two people don't have an anti-Semitic, let alone an anti-racist bone in their bodies, but they are a danger to the establishment as we know it. So what we have a responsibility to do, those of us working for peace, working against this extreme militarism that we perceive, have to commit ourselves to being totally anti-racist. You cannot be an anti-racist if you don't mind if there's Islamophobia in the world. You cannot be anti-racist if you're okay with the fact that an entire block of flats burns to the ground, killing dozens and dozens of its inhabitants because they happen to be poor and therefore perceived as less important, and companies can do what they want. This is a total struggle, and it brings me to what hope. What can journalists do? The first part of this struggle, and it is a struggle, is information. You know, social media in some ways is a wonderful thing, but it also has the problematic that an enormous amount of the information that appears on social media isn't verified. So I would say to all journalists out there, and this includes citizen journalists who are as important as what we perceive as formal journalists, first of all, make sure about the accuracy of your information. It's why the Shadow World book is this thick, because it has almost 3,000 footnotes, because everything we claim, everything we write about, everything we talk about publicly is verified by evidentiary documents. And I think that's a very important starting point. And then I think one has to be part of a broader political struggle, because while, for instance, on the arms trade, we have to, in parallel, fight to ensure that the laws and regulations that do exist are actually enforced so that the Yemens can't happen. At the same time, we have to accept that alone is not going to deal with the ills that the global arms trade imposes on our world. The only thing that is going to do that is fundamental, structural, political, and economic change to our societies. And that addresses the issues of racism, the issues of militarization of police, and crucially, the issue of climate crisis. These are all one struggle. So in conclusion, can I say to you, first of all, again, in thanking Stop the War for this opportunity, and to Lowkey and Lindsey for participating in it, please feel free to contact me if you have further questions after the film. I've put my email address on the chat for you. We're also on all sorts of social media as Shadow World Investigations, or just look for me, Andrew Feinstein. Please follow our work. Please listen to Lowkey's music. If you're in the United Kingdom, please join Stop the War and support their work. And wherever else in the world you are, do likewise. If you don't know of organizations in your locality, contact me and I'll link you to them. The only way in which we are going to see a world that is less corrupt, less brutal, and more safe is if we all work together to achieve it?
Well, that's a very stirring conclusion to what's been a great discussion. I'd like to thank both of you for your very kind words about Stop the War, but more importantly for a really, really informed and interesting debate here. I'd also like to thank everybody who's joined us tonight, and thank you for all your questions. There are a whole number of things that you can go on the chat and you can discuss with each other, and you can answer some of the questions. Andrew said that you can contact him through the chat, but if you can't for any reason locate his email, contact us at Stop the War on our website and we'll make sure that it's available to you. So just two things to say in conclusion. Firstly, please, to echo Andrew, please do join Stop the War. It's incredibly important for us that we have an organisation. These wars, we've had Stop the War now, it's our 20th anniversary next year, which is what I never thought would happen when we started. But anyway, it's a fairly frightening thing, but it tells you how much we need to continue, and we will continue, but we need your help and your activity and your organisation to do it. And just finally, you're in for a great treat in terms of this film. It is a very engaging film. It covers a huge amount of ground. It covers all sorts of things that we haven't really talked about tonight. For example, the American war, the Reagan in Latin America, and all sorts of things that you'll find incredibly interesting and useful to you. And I hope you'll be very inspired to campaign and organise. So thank you again very much to Lowkey and to Andrew Feinstein. When I stop, you will get on the screen the details of how you link to the film. You can do it at any time. You can watch it till midnight tonight. And you need a password, which is Shadow World. And you should have a link when you signed in here. So you should be able to get it. But if there's any problems, just go to the chat and you should be able to find the link, and it will be up on the screen now. So thank you very, very much, everybody. Thanks to our speakers. Have a great time watching the film and keep campaigning and keep fighting. Thanks a lot.